what we had been talking, because we've been just bragging about you. So it would have, if you were having a bad day, this would have solved
I
everything.
wasn't having a bad day until about 15 minutes ago. That's okay. That's okay. Yeah.
All right. So it's great to see you. Where are you now? Are you at Berkeley? Are you in Detroit? Or where are you these days?
I'm in Princeton, New Jersey.
You're in Princeton. Okay.
I haven't lived in Detroit since about 1978.
Okay. Okay. What I was telling our audience, and we have a bookstore and several people from the Detroit area on this video right now. But I was living in Detroit during the events that you wrote
Really?
about.
Wow.
Yeah,
Amazing.
over by I don't know if you remember where Redford High School
Yep.
is, Redford Township. That's where I was living, and the events. I'm not going to spoil it for those who haven't read the book, but the events you're kind of focusing, the current events that you're picking up on, all of that was going on while I was living there, and so to read your account these many years later was still just sort of a hair-raising kind of thing. So has that been on your mind for a long time, that you wanted to really get at that?
Well, I started writing a novel about this situation, about the anxiety and paranoia of being in a certain community, sort of like a geographical space, when something like this is happening, especially such horrific crimes. So I started writing about that a long time ago, I guess like 25 years ago, and I set it aside, or I did something else. But I think the interesting thing is, for those of us like you and like me who lived through it, we didn't really know at the time what was going on. And it's only years later when you can go through the internet and do research in the Babysitter. You know, many years later, maybe decades later, we find out more information about things. It tends to be that way in life. You live through something that's existentially very, very dramatic and very stressful, but you don't have a clue really what's happening until maybe years later when you read about it.
Yeah, and that was I didn't realize, those cases, have those ever been resolved? I thought that was sort of an unsolved crime.
Well, that's why I wrote about it. I like to write about, I've done a number of unsolved American crimes, or
Right.
using murder cases that were never really adjudicated. You know, it's sort of thought that people know who might have done it, but they don't know exactly, and there wasn't a conviction. So in the case of Babysitter, there was never anybody identified
Right.
publicly. The law enforcement had ideas who the suspects were. I think they were, you know, interviewing many people. But this is just on the background of my novel. What I became almost more interested in was this whole network of enablers and people who are allowing atrocities to happen. They don't want to get involved, they look the other way. And obviously there was some sort of pedophile ring. Now, my novel is not actually about the pedophile.
It's not at all. I don't want to give the wrong impression here to readers.
It's sort of in the background, and then this whole idea of enabling, like Jeffrey Epstein and all the people who are enabling him. Somehow that theme of enabling evil is very much of the present time, like 2022. Whereas when we were living through it, this is 1977, there was no thought about that at all. I don't think words like enablers probably didn't even exist.
Right. Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought this up. This is not a book that's about pedophilia. It's not a book necessarily about child abductions. That's just sort of the framework or the context in which these main characters are doing what they're doing. And one of the things I just was so intrigued by was this main character. Her name is Hannah, who when I finished the book, I thought, I still don't know if Hannah knows who she is. she's been defined by all of these other things. She's been defined by her husband, by her lover, by the group she runs around with, by her children, by her nanny. But does she know who she is? And that's kind of one of the internal conflicts that's going on in that book. Would you agree?
Well, yes, she, like all of us, she finds herself doing things sometimes she doesn't exactly know the purpose or the reason for. But when she acts impulsively, like taking care of, protecting her children, it does seem that's sort of a central core identity. She acts impulsively. She realizes that her children are really very, very important to her. And so other things become less important. I thought you were going to say you don't really know if she's alive or dead.
Oh no, I have my own theories of what your ending means, but again, that's something I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't read it. But yeah, does that question come up as to whether she's still alive?
Well, I like to write works of fiction in which there are kind of alternate possibilities and alternate realities. I'm so haunted by the lives that we don't lead and the very plausible possibilities of lives that we haven't led. So Hannah, in a sense, could possibly be, she could possibly have died. I mean, there is the suggestion that she's not alive. At the same time, she's still leading out, she's playing out the scene. I felt so strongly in writing this novel, maybe it's the way I feel about my life. So much of what we do is play out a scene. She thinks about that a couple of times. This is almost there's no reality to what we're doing, but we gotten into certain situations in our lives existentially. We all are, you know, we're defined by family, or we married somebody, or this, that, you know, or some people are ill in the hospitals. And so basically that's what you are. You are what you're living through. So you have to sort of play out the scene. I hope it doesn't sound cynical, but I noticed in rereading the novel, or parts of the novel, that was very much on my mind. It was a pandemic novel. It was written during the height of the pandemic.
So yeah, so were you feeling a little trapped at the time yourself when you were reading, or did the pandemic actually serve you well?
Well, let's just try to remember what it was like, say, in March 2020, and leading into the spring. And then later on, I think we got the vaccine at some point. But before we got the vaccine, many of us knew people who were ill, and two of my friends died. Two of my friends died within the first couple of weeks of the lockdown. So we didn't know. We were all in a kind of rudderless boat, and we were kind of going down this rapid stream. And when I was writing the novel, I wanted to put it in the historical present, so that Hannah is always in the hotel. She's always going to the hotel room. She starts off that way, and she's at the end, she's still there.
Right.
The different times in her life, she's during the hotel room, you know, is this something that she really should do? Is this a terrible mistake? But she's playing out the scene.
Well, to continue that though, it seems like one of the pieces in her life that I kept thinking about was, does she have free will? You know, it sometimes she confronts this. I could turn this direction, or I could turn that direction, and she goes back to doing something that she knows she shouldn't do. It's almost like there's this gravitational pull for her to do something she knows she should not do. So
Well,
are you saying something about free will there?
I think it's a very interesting subject, and it's very paradoxical. You can argue from the point of view of, say, materialism, that we don't have any free will, but we all feel that we have free will. We feel that we can make a choice. I'm not so sure that people are making choices in an intellectual way. People do things for reasons that they don't know. There are neuroscientific experiments that will show that people will do something for no reason at all, but then they give a reason, they make up a reason. But I'm so interested in these interim states as we're moving towards some irrevocable event. For instance, you have a call from the hospital and your beloved person is in the hospital and you have to hurry, you have to drive there. So as you're driving to the hospital, you're in this kind of quandary where you don't know when you get there if that person is going to be alive, but the person might be alive. So then when you get there, it's as if everything fell into place. Oh, yes, the person is alive and he's going to be all right. But it might have easily gone the other way. So I'm so interested in these interim states that I find myself in a lot. And the whole pandemic was like that. We don't really yet know what's coming. So the whole novel is mostly in the present tense.
Right. Yeah, it's
And
in the present. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I would say you get the summons to go to this place, and the easy thing is to stay home. So the easy thing is for most of us not to take the risk or not to go out and drive in the car. Just stay home. It's easier to do. It's safe, and you can watch television tonight. You know, but if you go and take this other risk, then you've embarked upon an adventure. So too, with people who are writing novels or any kind of creative activity, they make a choice, or we make a choice to do something that could be irrevocably be a mistake. It could be devastating, or it could be something very positive. I find myself just so fascinated by these states of being that are not resolved, because ultimately our whole lives are this interim state, and we don't really know how it's going to be resolved. Most of the time we don't think about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. With the writing students that I have, and I'm sure you've encountered this with some of your students as well, there is maybe a reflexive kind of tendency to resolve conflicts by the end of their story, and that's not nearly as interesting as the unresolved conflicts, right? Because that's a little more like life.
Yes, well, it is interesting, because if you tell a story like Once Upon a Time and it's past tense, then the story's all over. So it's just kind of something finite and safe about that. Like, this happened to me in 1999, you know? But if you're telling a story in present tense, the idea is that it hasn't really ended yet. And that's kind of a breathless mode, which I thought was very relevant to the time that we're in.
Oh yeah, no question, because we don't know how this is going to resolve, if it's going to resolve.
Well, we particularly did it during the height of the pandemic. Now there's not so much anxiety, but when I was writing it, there was a lot of anxiety. I mean, I live in New Jersey. We were locked down. I think it was like March 12th, 2020. So we were sort of locked down, and given to think that we shouldn't even leave our houses. And my university shut down. I was at two universities. They both shut down. So there was a sense of a lot of anxiety. And as time went on, because it's been quite a while now, we got used to it and we adapt to it. And some people did adapt pretty well, and other people didn't.
Yeah, and when you describe that kind of a scenario as the backdrop for emotionally for you, for why you were writing this, it makes the novel, it makes the Babysitter novel that much more intriguing in my view.
Well, when I lived in Detroit, and I had friends who were living in Birmingham and Bloomfield Hills, Franklin Hills, is it?
Yeah, in Franklin Township, yeah.
Franklin Township, yeah. Well, I had friends who had children of that age, that vulnerable age, between about the age of like 9 or 10 and 13. It was just a certain age group that the babysitter was abducting. He didn't try for really young children, and he didn't try for older children, just this one sort of cohort. But when I knew these people and I was seeing these women, they were in a state of anxiety about whether their children might be abducted. And in the schools, there was a like high alert, and you must never go with a stranger. And it was just everybody was thinking about this all the time. But if you get back into that mindset when you're actually in it, it's a very interesting, heightened mindset before it's resolved. Now, it was never resolved, but gradually he just stopped abducting and killing. So it's thought maybe he himself moved away, or he could be incarcerated. There are different theories about why he stopped. There's no reason for him to stop, evidently.
No, since he hadn't been caught. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Ted Bundy killed many, many women and girls. Ted Bundy killed more than he was convicted of. So
Yeah.
when you have a serial killer, there's actually no reason for him to stop. In some cases, they may want to be stopped. They may want to be caught. But while that was playing out in 1977, we didn't know how it would end. So that interests me more than writing about something that happened 20 years ago, where I know the ending.
That makes so much sense, and that's one of the reasons why the novel is well, for one thing, it's beautifully written, but it's so engaging because of the way you approached it. So I'm just wondering, with that sense of this abductor, this he's killing people. People have said you're just drawn to themes of evil. Is that an accurate portrayal of some of the things you write about?
I don't think I'm drawn to scenes of evil. I'm really drawn to very intense, dramatic experiences. My novel before this is called Breathe, and that was very much about my own experience when I lost my husband. I wanted to write down absolutely in every anguishing detail what it's like to be in the hospital vigil and then losing somebody, and then the aftermath, which I found so extraordinary, of really being haunted. It's only recently, this happened in 2019, it's really only recently that I don't feel I'm so haunted by the experience. I mean, I probably still am. So there's nothing evil in that novel. It's more like the dramatic existential experiences that we have to endure as people, just as human beings. A brush with evil. In this case, Hannah's really having an adventure with this man, and she never really knows exactly who he is. And that experience of hers, I think, is a profound experience. I would be afraid to have that myself. But, there are men who, maybe women, but there are men who are adventurers, who set sail. It's in our genes. They do things like Shackleton. I mean, there are extraordinary things that people do that seem quite foolish and dangerous. And most people would say, no, I would never do that. Now, writers and filmmakers, perhaps even more, are drawn to people like that, risk-taking.
Yeah. I think in addition to those themes, you also, in many of your novels, you build in kind of commentary about race and about class and about gender. And I was really drawn to this statement where she said, where the narrator is saying, if a woman is not desired, a woman does not exist. And then she follows that up with, help me to exist. So that's part of her struggle, right? Is she wants to be seen, which the way she interprets that is she wants to be desired. And that just, I don't know, that just struck me as such a bold statement, but it also struck me as that's probably accurate for a lot of people.
Well, it certainly is accurate for, the larger world, like popular culture. We're besieged by people who are very beautiful and, I guess they're very desirable. Popular culture, movies, music is filled with people like that. They are physically very attractive. They may not be secure. They may feel anxiety that they're getting older or something's wrong with them, but they are very, very attractive. So I do know people like this. Now it's less evident. Or writing books, you really don't have to have physical beauty to, fortunately, to be a writer. But if you're an actor in the public eye, I mean, I wrote a whole novel about Norma Jean Baker, who becomes Marilyn Monroe, and she's overwhelmed by this persona that she created herself, which is so desirable, but ultimately it suffocates her and she's actually destroyed by it. The same sort of thing may have happened with Elvis Presley. It may happen with a number of celebrities, maybe
Right.
Michael Jackson. The self that you were when you came to prominence is a certain self, but then years go by and you're still out there. You cannot be that. So when Marilyn Monroe or Norma Jean Baker died at the age of 36, she was like 10 years after her first prominence, and she was still being given the kind of roles she was being given at the age of 26. And she didn't like that. She was very unhappy with that. It was sort of like suffocation.
I think go ahead. I'm sorry.
But Hannah would feel that way. She's only 39 or 40 years old. She is very attractive, and she's in that world I remember very well. The women were very beautiful. They were married to extremely well-to-do men. And as time went on, the men divorced them and got trophy wives. I mean, they basically, in some cases, would marry a younger woman who looked like the first wife, but the first wife is, 50 years old, and it's kind of all over.
Well, and I'm thinking about, early on in the book where Hannah is asked, which one are you? The reference being, which wife are you? So that's how she's pigeonholed, is that she is the wife of one of these executives. And that's why I meant early on, where she's always this, she's a role player in all of these different aspects, which, yeah, that's why she takes this turn to go to the Renaissance Center instead of that turn to go back home. It's I just thought it was fascinating. One of the other lines that let me go back to the, if a woman is not seen or desired, that's partly the phenomena of a lot of social media. It strikes me as that is a definition of existence, is that if I have a lot of people who are seeing me online, if I have a lot of followers, if I had a lot of likes, that gives, at least for the time being, that gives me some meaning. Do you see that parallel?
Well, it seems to give meaning. I think obviously it doesn't.
Right.
It's just sort of a vapor, like tomorrow it's all gone. But if you think about the domestic situation, the people live domestic lives. They can be very famous and have billions of dollars, but basically you're living in a family. If you're fairly lucky, you may have a spouse, you may have children, you may have parents living. Like you have a little hive. Hannah speaks about the hive family, and that keeps you warm. Mm-hmm. That is your identity. Your identity is that. It's not really what's online or on Twitter. And it's not really, for people who are actors, it's not really how much money they made. It's, do you have a spouse who actually loves you? Is somebody going to hold your hand when you're very ill? Is somebody going to hold you when you die? Like, those questions come back to haunt us. You really have to have somebody who cares for you. Mm-hmm. And that anxiety that Hannah's feeling, it isn't really just sexual, it's something deeper. She knows that her children love her, but they only see her as a mother. I mean, they're just these little children. They love their mother, but they don't know who she is. So she looks at her husband, Wes, and she can tell he doesn't really care about her much anymore. He's distracted. He's got his other life. So her questions, I think, are existentially very valid for all of us. I wouldn't have solved her existential question by doing what she does, but I might do it in my own way.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great point. And so with the identity crisis that she has a chance to break out of, it has all of these other kind of consequences. And that's one of the things you were talking about before, is you make that turn, and let's see how this scene plays out. You know, you've done this with also one other religious, there's kind of a religious theme that bubbles up every now and then. During her affair, she's in her mind, she's going through the Stations of the Cross. There are these references to priests and things. Where's that coming from? How does that fit in with what you were trying to say?
Well, I'm not a Christian person, but I find a Christian iconography very interesting. But the idea that we all walk through the valley. You have to walk that lonesome valley, you know the hymn?
I do.
You have to walk that lonesome valley, you have to walk it by yourself. Nobody else can walk it for you. You walk it by yourself. So it's like the iconography of Jesus Christ on the cross is something that we all have to accept and experience, that we're broken by life. Essentially, some of us maybe more than once, you know, like you can die more than one death in your life, and you can lose people whom you love so much that it's like your own death, you know.
Mhm.
So Hannah's connecting with this. She's in this sacrificial state. Is she going to give up her family? She's putting her life on the line. Now she does have an alternative possibility, an alternative universe in which she was murdered, because there are lines where she's just a body. She's lying in this gurney in the morgue, and there's a smell of formaldehyde. It was just as likely, it was quite possible that she was going to be killed because of what she did.
Mhm.
Now, as the novel works out, it seems that maybe that didn't happen. But how narrowly we may have escaped something like that happening to us. You know, you get in your car and you drive on an expressway, and that's the very time when there was going to be this multi-vehicle cataclysm. But you started out too early for it and you got past it, but it wasn't implausible, you know.
No.
I'm not really writing about things that are fantastic or far-fetched. It's more things that are very, very likely, very close to have happened, but somehow didn't, but might happen next week.
Yeah. And your choices are involved in all of those things. Some intentional and some just sort of instinctive, right?
Yes, there were only a couple of times in my life that I took a real chance on something. And I think because of the pandemic and spending a lot of time alone, we all tend to be thinking back on our lives a little more, like, how did we get to where we are? But I remember something that I did when I was only about 21, and it really was quite against my personality. And it wasn't impulsive. I mean, I thought about it, but it was very surprising to people who knew me. And when I think back on it now, I don't know that I don't think I'd have the courage now to take that plunge into the unknown that I did then. But it's only those turning points in our lives that really ultimately make a difference.
Yeah, and that's what you spend so much beautiful writing on in this book and in so many of your other books. I was just really intrigued by this book, and I just loved reading it. We're going to go to some questions that have come in the chat. I do want to tell you, I'm sorry to hear about your husband. And I know that the grieving process is long, and I hope you're okay.
Thank you.
So one of the questions is, do you still write longhand?
Oh, yes, I have all this writing. I'm working on a new novel. I've all these notes, yes. Nobody would believe how messy everything is.
Oh, that's good. And I think
sort of write. Yeah, that's, well, it starts off that way. It doesn't stay that way. Then I go to the word processor.
so. Part of the lore about you is not only do you do this longhand, but some of these you do in the bathtub. Is there any validity to that?
No, goodness.
Okay.
I don't even, I take showers. I never really liked baths.
Yeah, glad you could clear that up.
Baths are so enervating. I can't imagine taking a bath. Also, it takes too long. No, I write. I mean, I start writing at about 7 in the morning, and I take a lot of breaks during the day. I go out, I spend time, I go for a bicycle ride or a run. You know, I mean, I have a fairly normal life, but I always come back to what I'm working on. So before I go to bed, it might be like 1 o'clock in the morning. I'll come back and just do a little writing for maybe 15 minutes or so, kind of just checking in all day long.
Sure. I remember something you told me when you and I talked at my school at our writers symposium a few years ago, that you spend a lot of your time just looking out the window. Is that still part of the deal?
I'm looking out the window right now, but it's dark outside. Yes, I can only work if I have a window.
All right. And is there a cat involved somewhere who will
I'm looking for the cats, but they're not here right now. Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's all right. That's really the only reason some people got
Where
on
they
this. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Xanchi should be here. Should I look for her?
No, no,
That's the next question. I'll listen to it.
we've seen cats before. So what years did you live in Detroit? That's one of the questions, because we have some people from Detroit on here.
Oh, okay. Oh my goodness. Well, here's a kitty.
All right. This is totally worth it now. I think it was still not, no one was really clear whether this was worthwhile. Now, look at those eyes.
No, Lilith is not like Xanchi. Xanchi is the one who loves to be on Zoom, and she gets lots of fan mail and attention. But this kitty is more like a normal cat. She's not a prima donna. She just wants to go down. So your question was?
Well, from the Detroit audience, what years were you there? I know you taught in a variety of schools there and everything.
Yeah, I was there from 1963 to 1967. Then I moved to Windsor, and I kept all my contacts. I mean, I was in Detroit a lot, and I saw my friends. So 1977, 1976, the time of Babysitter, I was still very much in that area. Many people probably don't know that Windsor, Ontario, is south of Detroit. Actually, it's
yeah. We think of Canada as north of the United States, but
yeah.
Good point.
I'm very haunted by Detroit. I was really a very young woman, young wife, young instructor then, and life was coming at me really rapidly. So I got so much material just sort of imprinted in my memory or my brain. I mean, when I was writing Babysitter, it was just, I was right back there driving along the John Lodge Expressway, down Gratiot, all these wonderfully named streets and roads in the Detroit area, and out in Bloomfield Hills and Birmingham, all the Last Year Road and Woodward, like just it's almost like lullabies. I'm just hypnotized by the names of the streets and the different parts of the city and the different neighborhoods, and also the names of the suburbs, Grosse Pointe Farms, St. Clair Shores, all of it, Redford. To me, it's just so, I can't even express how haunting it is.
It's interesting, all of those descriptions of, names and freeways and all that, and then you have 6 Mile, 5 Mile, 4 Mile. You've got there's no imagination at all.
8 Mile.
8 Mile, made famous by Eminem.
Eminem, yeah. Well, he lived around. Well, at one point I lived around 8 Mile. Yeah. Well, all these things I think are so haunting that maybe to be a writer is just to be caught in a sort of cobweb of these strange things. Like, it just gives me a lot of pleasure to type out those names or speak them aloud. I think I once wrote a poem just of all the street names in Detroit.
What about let's talk about Blonde for a second. Are you happy with what's happening with Netflix and the series on Blonde?
Well, it's actually a movie. It's not a series. It's a feature film. Yes, it's quite brilliant. Andrew Dominic selected from quite a long novel. He selected a certain story, a trajectory, and it's one that I feel really expresses the novel. It's a kind of paradox that Norma Jean Baker is saved by becoming Marilyn Monroe. She has to save her life, but becoming Marilyn Monroe is the means by which she's then destroyed. And I think that's really maybe the predominant theme of the novel. The novel's was 1,400 pages in manuscript, so a lot of things in a novel that are not in the movie. And that's the way it should be. The movie has to have its own fluidity,
right,
and its own coherence.
And so you're happy with what's happened with it?
Oh,
with
yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
good.
well, I'm also not a critical person, and I'm more interested to see what other creative artists have done. Anya de Armas's performance is just mesmerizing. She's really Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was a performance, so she's performing Marilyn Monroe, and it's heartbreaking. She's so vulnerable. There are scenes in it that are very painful because they're so riveting to watch. And then the other actors are beautifully cast. So Andrew Dominic is a very idiosyncratic and special director. He never does anything conventional. So it's like his interpretation of Blonde.
I'm also thinking during the pandemic, you had some time to read. What do you have some favorites of the last couple of years?
Well, during the pandemic, I was teaching. Ultimately, I taught 6 courses on Zoom. So
good for you.
I had plenty of activity. I mean, I was reading my students' work and reading, it wasn't that unusual for me. I think some people maybe were more shut-ins, but and didn't have that much to do, but I was always very engaged. But I did read War and Peace. I had started it numerous times, but never finished it. But I read it with a book club, which was perfect, 12 pages a day.
Okay. It sounds more doable that way.
Yeah, and it's fun when a number of people, maybe several hundred people, were reading it all together. Oh, wow. My colleague and friend at Princeton, Young Lee, was leading it.
Nice. Do you have any recommendations for us of recent books that you've encountered?
Oh, well, I read all the time. You're putting me on the spot.
That's all right. That's what I do.
Read it's just that if I name a title, it's not that important. Like, it might be just something that comes to my mind rather than something significant. But I did read the new biography of Jean Reese by Miranda Seymour, which I recommend. Jean Reese.
Okay.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Okay. What about, I always like to ask when I talk to writers, I always like to ask them for advice because there's always somebody who's kind of new to the writing world. And excuse me. And whether it's short story or, would you recommend somebody starting out with short story, or if they feel like they've got a novel in them, how do you tell them to proceed?
Well, I wouldn't recommend writing a novel actually for anybody. You have to be sort of crazy to write a novel, at least a long novel. It's just such an ordeal. But short stories and poems and flash fictions, those are wonderful genres. A long, serious novel with a lot of characters and taking place over a period of time, it's actually very arduous. And whoever you thought you were when you started it, a lot of time is going to go by before you finish it. So that early person could be a couple of years ago. I know people work on novels 10, 15 years and they never finish them. So I would definitely recommend start out short forms and finish them. I have a lot of emphasis in my writing workshops on finishing what you've done, your project, and then revise it and it's finished and try to get it published. It's like stepping stones across the river. Once you do that, you'll feel really good. One good short story. Flannery O'Connor would spend 6 months on a short story. Was it worth it? Of course. It was worth it. Flannery O'Connor's short stories are wonderful.
Yeah.
She didn't write them in 6 days or 6 weeks. She wrote them in 6 months. And also Alice Munro spent a lot of time in her writing. Now I spend a lot of time because I'm working a lot at my desk. I don't spend time by other people's measurement because most people who write, I think, don't work as long as I do. Like I can work 10 or 12 hours a day. So other people say, well, Joyce is writing so fast, like she's got a new novel. What if you're comparing me with other people who only write a couple hours a day or take the weekend off, then the measurement of time is different. But I actually love to write and I love to revise. So to me, waking up in the morning is very exciting because I'll start writing. But I do have friends, I think Richard Ford is one of them. He'll just take months off. He's going to go hunting, and that's wonderful. He can just do that, but I've never done that.
But back to what you had said earlier about Babysitter, that was a novel you started, you said, many years ago and set aside. Why did you set it aside?
Well, I also read a story called Babysitter about 10 or 12 years. I don't remember when, but I wrote the short story Babysitter more recently. That could be like 10 years ago. I'm not clear about the dates anymore. But because these things sort of rattle around in your head, you yourself, since you lived through the Babysitter era, you may have a novel that you wanted to write about being in high school at that time and having friends and family and babysitters sort of in the background. That would be your novel to write, but you might not get around to it. You could be 60 years old because things sort of have to come together. I think this idea of enabling sexual predators, just enabling them, has suddenly come to consciousness in 2020, 2021, Jeffrey Epstein and others.
Harvey Weinstein, sure.
Yeah, Harvey Weinstein. And the way that these predators were allowed to do what they did by nice people. People who enabled them were not monsters, and they were probably disapproving and shocked. I mean, they probably were unhappy, but they didn't stop it. So that to me is a very contemporary theme that I wouldn't have had in 1977.
That's a really interesting point, that this is a more kind of complete idea, or at least it's a bigger idea than had you written it while it was going on. That's fascinating.
That's the way life is. Like Babysitter himself, the actual person, it's thought that he committed suicide.
Hmm.
It seems that law enforcement officers think he committed suicide. So I take that idea and I'm thinking, well, maybe he did, but maybe he actually was murdered. Maybe somebody had had enough of him
Mm-hmm.
because he's in a sort of pedophile community.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't seem to be implausible that somebody might have killed him. To me, that was a possibility.
So I got a question just popped up. Were you ever a babysitter?
Well, I was a babysitter, but babysitter in the novel is not a babysitter.
That's true. That's true. It's a different use of the word, isn't it? Yeah.
We should explain why he's called babysitter, because nobody listening would know. He was called babysitter because the abductor took the children for a few days. They were always gone for a while, could be 3 or 4 days or longer. So he was torturing them or doing things to them, heaven knows. But then when their bodies were found, they were always naked. Their hands were folded on their chests, and their clothing had been laundered. They had been bathed. They were very clean. And then their clothing was laundered and put beside them.
Mm-hmm.
So he was like a babysitter in a very malevolent, horrific, sinister way. He was caring for them, bathing them, washing their hair. He took the dirt out of their fingernails. He did lots of things. He may have wanted to get his DNA out of the fingernails, but in 1977, I don't think there was DNA. So today, if all that cleansing went on, we think, well, he's getting rid of the DNA. But all these macabre details are what gave the popular culture gave him the name babysitter, because he was taking so much care.
Yeah.
He positioned the children in parks and public places very carefully where he might have gotten caught. He must have done it at night, but he could have gotten caught. So a lot of different things he was doing that were idiosyncratic.
So let me finish up our conversation this way. What are you working on now that you can tell us about? And do you work on multiple projects at once? What can we expect?
Well, no, I usually just work on one novel at a time.
Okay.
So this novel is called Butcher.
Of course it is.
But this novel is about 3 men of medical pioneers of the 19th century who were very famous in their own time and very, very admired. But when we look at what they did, they were preying upon women. One of them is J. Marion Sims, the father of American gynecology, who experimented on Black women's enslaved women without any anesthesia. And he experimented on young Irish girls, like immigrant Irish girls who were very poor. There's a whole class of poor people who were indentured servants in the United States. And they also, like slaves, they didn't have any rights. They didn't have any citizenship, and they were preyed upon. So I'm writing about him, and I'm writing about Weir Mitchell, who's the doctor that Charlotte Perkins Gilman writes about in The Yellow Wallpaper. And then a more recent pioneer in psychoneurology, I guess he called it, Henry Cotton, who was the director of an insane asylum for women in Trenton for many, many years, like 3 decades. So I'm writing about these men and what they did to women, but it does have a happy ending in the sense that women, like they declare, they unify, they unify against him. There's an insurrection against him. The novel is a little bit of a fable or a fairy tale, or though it's based on real experiences, it's also somewhat surreal.
Well, I can't wait for that to come out. If I'm just always impressed and just energized by reading your work. So, and it's always fun talking with you. I'm I'm glad we got a chance to talk. We're gonna get Julie from Warwick's back in here. And
Wrap it
yeah.
up.
Yeah,
Julie,
thank
come
you
in and
so
wrap it
much.
up.
Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joyce, very much. You had lots of love in the chat. People were joining us from Madrid and Italy and all over the country.
Well, I'm happy I persevered. It was hard to get on.
I know. So I'm glad you persevered and we made this happen. Somebody from Europe did ask though, do people is your work somehow received differently in Europe than the United States, do you feel?
Well, I can't really answer that. There are many countries in Europe and,
Right.
you know.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's a
good
hard one. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce.